Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tokiwa Smith. I am the principal of Tokiwa T Smith Consulting, and I want to welcome you to our Chat and Chew. Our Chat and Chew is our virtual workshop series that we host quarterly, a couple of times a year. We didn't do it for a few months. Um, that we talk about conversations where we center the Black experience about different issues of systemic racism and racial inequities in education and philanthropy. 'Cause these are conversations that we don't get to have, or when they are had, they are not centered in our experience, nor are people like us leading these conversations. And so I wanted to make sure that we lead these conversations, partially so we can be honest and open about them, but also so we can come up with our own solutions for these issues within our sphere of influence, because lately we've been seeing we all we got is Black people. And so we are our own saviors, and taking a step from our ancestors where we were in community to solve our issues. And so I am so excited. Sierra and I have known each other for a long time. When I have advice about storytelling and communications, I automatically shift to her. I'll email her. I have questions. She's recommended books, and she is this amazing communications expert storytelling. And the reason why I decided to resume it with this conversation, this topic of storytelling, is a couple of things. We have these conversations where we see, especially in nonprofit and education, how people talk about children that look like us. Also, how a lot of storytelling in nonprofit and education um, is very deficit model, like white savior complex. Like, if we don't come in as an organization, especially organizations that are not led by us, um, we are saving these kids, these poor kids, as opposed to a couple of things: addressing the systemic issues that are causing these things. But secondly, like, these people in these communities are people who have stories that are empowering. And it is important that we do responsible storytelling. Another thing that Sierra and I talked about as we were developing the conversations for this conversation is, and I'm guilty of it too, Black leaders don't share our own stories enough, right? So then there's this narrative of, when Black led orgs aren't doing X, Y, Z, we need training, we don't understand, like, all of these things, versus most of us created our organizations. We have the talent, but it's just this narrative. And we really want to, when we tell our own stories, we can change the narrative. Um, and so that is why we're having this conversation. I have an engineering degree, I can't lead it. So that is why we're bringing a communication expert in to guide this conversation. So if you have questions throughout, you can just raise your hand. Sierra will pay attention. I'm not that great at paying attention, but this is, a dialogue of, oh, I'm gonna pray my internet it's starting to rain here. Um, a dialogue about how do we use storytelling as a powerful tool. So, Sierra, I'm gonna start with the first question. Let's start with your own journey. What drew you to the world of communications and marketing, in particular, the nonprofit sector?
Okay, so first I do want to say good afternoon to everyone. It is a pleasure to be here and speaking with you guys today in Tokiwa. But we have known each other for quite a while, so it's always nice to see you. Yeah, and I would just say I usually start my story about my journey with AmeriCorps. I'm pretty sure some of you are familiar with AmeriCorps. It is basically the domestic version of the Peace Corps. I attended Clark Atlanta University, a HBCU in Atlanta, Georgia. I graduated with a business and marketing degree, and I immediately thought to myself, the corporate sector is just not going to be for me. I think some of my friends saw that I was a little worried about that as well. So I had some graduate school friends suggest AmeriCorps and City Year and programs within a nonprofit space. And I've been in the nonprofit sector since then, which has been quite a while. So that's kind of how I got into communications and storytelling and marketing as a whole. I think you're okay.
Yeah, we hear a lot about the power of storytelling, but what exactly is storytelling and why is it so critical that nonprofit organizations to invest in it?
Yeah, I think storytelling at its core is sharing your lived experiences. And it's as simple as that. And believe it or not, I've learned a lot about storytelling from children's literature. I've been particularly studying children's literature, some of the older books and some new authors. And it really comes down to just realizing that as leaders, we tend to overcomplicate our stories. And sometimes the simple, authentic stories are the stories that move people the most. So I think it's really important, as nonprofit leaders, that we're investing in storytelling to move others when it comes to, volunteers and donors and giving, and even in a way reclaiming the space in the nonprofit sector that has been historically taken from us in some different ways. So that's why I think storytelling is just really important and essential.
And I like how you say reclaiming, like it's reclaiming our story, reclaiming our narrative, because
Mm-hmm.
often people are telling our stories for us without our
Yeah.
input. So I like that reclaiming. Why do you believe storytelling is a core leadership skill, especially for Black nonprofit leaders?
Yeah, I think it goes back to reclaiming that power. And just like you said, oftentimes the stories that relate to the missions that we're pushing and we're motivating others to join in on are told in ways that we probably wouldn't tell them. So these stories are often told about us, and rather than us telling the stories or even us being centered as communities and as collaborative efforts who are pushing the mission for it, rather than just the leader who is just poised with doing the work. So I think storytelling is essential to leadership, and it's also essential to reclaiming that power in these spaces that have historically excluded us.
Yes. So, what are some common pitfalls that you see in nonprofit storytelling, particularly among organizations that serve Black and or under-resourced communities?
Mhm. So again, I mentioned that I started my journey in AmeriCorps, and my position was actually centered in financial literacy and poverty reduction. So at that time, which was almost a decade ago, telling stories with this poverty, kind of like sort of poverty storytelling was really popular at that time, just because of the work that we were doing. And I see that even organizations now are still using that outdated kind of storytelling framework. And I think there's just given the potential in the digital age that we live in, where we're seeing social media and we're seeing so many different methods of communication, there's so many opportunities to find stories and connect with others to push the stories that we want to tell. So I think that it's really important to not latch on to the old frameworks and old mindsets around storytelling, like poverty storytelling. There's so much potential in telling the stories in a different and creative way.
Okay. So, I have a new question that I send you based on your comments.
Okay.
So, you talked about the importance of using new frameworks.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do we even know if our frameworks are outdated? And then how do we transition to find newer, more effective frameworks?
Yeah, I think it definitely starts with being creative. Again, I mentioned that a lot of my storytelling uh, work comes from children's literature. So finding inspiration in something as unique as that can really help us to find and tell different stories. And I also think that, I'm sorry, can you repeat the second half of the question?
How do we find the new, like, how do we know that we're using old frameworks? And how do we
Right.
find the inspiration to
Yeah.
create new frameworks?
Yeah, I think so. I'm not a huge fan of frameworks, to be honest with you.
Okay.
There's a lot of framework. There's like story brand and there's like story arc when it comes to children's literature and authorship. But I like again, I just like to look at best practices from other sectors. You
Okay.
know, maybe your mission is in food and agriculture, but you glean from climate change and social justice and the way they tell their stories. So I think just finding other ways to look at things and being able to spot a different frame and a different lens to
Mhm.
continue to tell the stories that you're telling can be really essential.
So let me make sure I recap this.
Yeah.
No frameworks, because those are sometimes too rigid and don't allow us to tell
Yes.
stories in authentic ways. So we
Mhm.
should look for best practices and examples of story that captures our attention when we're developing our own stories.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you, Tokiwa.
Okay. So can you share a few examples of nonprofits that are getting storytelling right, especially those serving Black communities and or under-resourced communities?
Yeah. So I have one that has been a favorite of mine over the last year or so. And it's Harlem Grown, if you guys are familiar with Harlem Grown. And again, you're always going to hear me relate to children's literature, but Tony Hillary, who is the leader and the founder of Harlem Grown, he's done a really great job at incorporating his personal story into the mission of Harlem Grown as a leader and CEO. And I think that the work they're doing and the way that they're communicating it and telling their stories, even when it comes down to like their Instagram page, has just been really great to watch. And I think they're a great example of an organization telling stories in creative ways. And a great example, again, of a leader who is incorporating their own personal story into their mission in driving their organization forward. Harlem Grown, yes. Thank you.
Mhm.
Is everyone familiar with Harlem Grown? If you haven't read the children's book, I do recommend to take a look at it. It is a great story.
Yeah. I love that book. Every time we
Okay.
buy books for community spaces, that is in the
Oh,
list of books.
wow. Okay. Yes, I love that.
Yeah. So, from your perspective as a communications expert, do you notice the difference between how Black leaders tell stories about their communities compared to non-Black leaders who do similar work?
Yes, I have noticed some differences. I believe the biggest difference has probably been that when Black leaders communicate and tell their stories, it's not transactional. It's a little bit more relational. And we tend to tell our stories almost like we're a part of the narrative and a part of the story, rather than just telling it to reach an audience.
Mhm.
And I believe that is just an asset that we bring to the space and the sector as well. And when it comes to non-Black leaders, again, I think we mentioned that they tend to center themselves in the story, and I think as Black leaders, we tend to bring in the communities, the businesses, the other people who are part of our mission into our stories. And that's just not always the case when I see non-Black leaders tell stories about organizations and their missions. I don't know. Have you seen that as well?
I have a few things that I really see
Mm,
sometimes where it's like you're coming in as like the white savior, and
yes,
this community would not be good unless we come in and save us. When I
exactly.
know that sometimes when I tell my own stories about my org or some of my favorite stories, it's
Hmm.
like we're doing this, to give back to what was given to us, right?
Right.
These people that we serving could be our kids, aunties, neighbors, friends. And
Exactly.
we're doing it because the love of our community, right? We understand that it's a for us by us thing, right? And so that
Exactly.
story is a lot different than when it
Yeah.
is told from people who don't have that experience, because sometimes I feel like other people dehumanize us,
Mm,
as well as, even if it's not a dehumanization.
mhm,
I was having a conversation a few last year with one of my really, really close white women friends. And one of the things that we were talking about, we were passing through Outer Banks, North Carolina, and she asked this question about people being displaced, losing their land. And she was like, "Oh, did they leave voluntarily?" And I'm like, "No, no." But just having this conversation about how other communities have the privilege to be ignorant about the Black experience, where we have to learn about them. And so even if it isn't a dehumanization, it
mhm,
is, you know, the privilege of not having to do it. Like, you can maneuver in this world without learning other people's stories and experiences. And I feel
yeah,
like that is where a lot of non-Black people, even other people of color,
mhm,
want to stay in their experience, when it's like we got to learn about everybody if we're going to, navigate and survive in the world. So that's what I've noticed when I
I
see
agree.
things.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, from your perspective, no, 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 that's not it. Come back. So we talk about nonprofit leaders telling, the stories of community they serve. But should nonprofit leaders be telling their own personal leadership stories as well? And why is it important, especially for Black leaders?
Yeah, again, I think that it is important for Black nonprofit leaders to tell their stories in collaboration with the stories of their organizations. It's about that authorship and reclaiming that authorship of those stories in these spaces when they are told by people who are non-white and non-connected to the mission in the ways that we are.
Mhm.
And I think that is really contagious as well. I mean, when we tell our stories, we also inspire other leaders who look like us, right, and come from the places that we come from to tell those similar stories and create that similar impact in the communities that we serve. So I think that we should be telling those stories alongside our missions, and I think again that Tony Hillary is doing a great job with that. Um, and
Yeah,
I'll just
no.
give you. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, go ahead,
I was going to give you a little bit of context. So
go ahead.
his story is really unique because he is actually an outsider of what some of the disparities that he saw in his community. So he lived, I think, about 20 minutes from Harlem, and
Mhm.
he was just going into the community as a volunteer at a school. And he found out that like 42% of Harlem was living in poverty. And he began to dig into, the disparities and the inequities of the community. And a young girl said, hey, there's a space across the street, let's clean it up. And then another student said, oh, let's start a garden. So I think that his story of being an outsider but still being able to contribute to such impactful work is a great example. If someone has a similar story, like maybe you don't have any personal connection to the mission, maybe you haven't experienced poverty, or maybe you haven't experienced any specific challenge within your community, but you can relate to it in a different way. And be mindful of how those people in those communities receive the story that you're telling.
So I like, and this is not a question that I pre, but I like how you say that in this experience, and I think sometimes all nonprofit leaders need to remember, although I think Black people are more sensitive to it, is that remembering that even if it is not your particular Black experience, right?
Mm,
You're still a part of the larger Black community. And how
yes.
do we are in community with one another in spite of having different experiences? Because
Mm-hmm.
Black people aren't a monolith, and it doesn't mean that we cannot connect with what we connect with. I
Yes.
always joke with some of my friends that are Black from other parts of the diaspora. And we're like, there's just some global Black thing, no matter where you are.
Yes,
Where your
yes.
family is from, that is like in our DNA, that we all, have that in
Hmm.
common. And
Yeah,
we can tell better stories when we remember like what we have in common with
yes.
our community, the global Black people stuff.
Right.
I was laughing because I was in Panama, um, and I posted some fried fish, and one of my friends was like, "Man, Black people globally gonna fry some good fish."
Yes,
I
we
was
are.
looking good.
And it might be on a Friday. Yes,
And
yes.
so, it didn't even dawn on me. I was just happy to be by the seafood, instead of,
Right.
just having that connection to who we are globally, and that
Yes,
impacts how we can tell our stories and connect with the communities that we serve, even if they
yes.
have a different experience from us.
Exactly. I'll actually share a story. I was recently at a writer's residency, and it was me and another African American girl. We were the only Black people there. And the house guests were doing a barbecue for us, like a cookout for us for dinner. It was like a number of other people as well. But it was like early in the morning. We happened to run into each other in the hallway, and we were like, "They're doing a barbecue, and they haven't started the grill yet." Like, we know, they're like, "You have to start the grill early so that you can get going." So it's just like coach again, that cultural context is really important. We can be different, but we're all really the same at the end of
Mhm. And planning what else you gonna eat,
the day.
like,
Right,
is the meat marinated?
right. Exactly, exactly.
All of those things. Yeah. Hopefully it turned out good.
Yeah,
So,
it was pretty good. It was shish
okay.
kebab, so
Oh, okay.
it's definitely quick.
If you mess up a shish kebab, like,
I
you
know,
should not
it's just not for
be
you.
grilling. Yeah. So there is a difference between storytelling and telling a story that moves. What
Mm,
sets those two apart?
yeah. Um, so when you think about a story in general, rarely do generic stories ever move people. So stories that lack specific details don't often land with people. And I'll just tell you some neurology behind this. So when you recount a significant experience, there's a certain portion of your brain that lights up. And then when you tell that story, a certain portion of the person you're telling it to, the same region lights up in their head. So I believe that like there's a neurological response to a good story in a good rather than like a generic story that doesn't really land with someone. Excuse me. And when
Mhm.
you think about stories like children's literature, again, you think about the smells that are mentioned, the tension in the story, the colors that are mentioned. Those details are what really connect with people and make a difference in like telling us a generic story and a story that really compels people to give or to take action.
Okay. And it makes me think of, I read sci-fi and mysteries. And it makes me think of like the books I finish, I can see the characters. Right
Mm.
now, I don't do horror, but there's this book that I picked up because it's a book of short stories, and it's like the Black
Hmm.
girl survives this one. So I'm like, oh, I gotta read this, and right, you don't do horror.
Yeah.
But when I tell you I have not picked that book up since February, because it's daytime reading, and it scares me sometimes because I'm like, these
Oh
are good
gosh.
storytelling.
Scary stories before nighttime.
Yeah, you can't read that at night. It's the middle of the day reading, so you can like calm back down and recenter yourself from the stories. And so I
Right.
think that what you're saying is like when we just tell storytelling, we're telling like mostly facts. Like
Yeah.
we served X amount of people, at these places. But when we move
Right.
to stories that move, we talk about the child who came back. Well, I'll just say a story from that I can think of. So
Yeah.
I used to do science with little kids a lot. And so in Oakland, I taught these 5-year-olds how to do air quality studies.
Mm.
And my friend was like, "You crazy, they 5." I'm like, little kids, they learn more. It's they learn. And
Yeah.
so we just did a simple experiment. We talked about particles, we talked about breathing good, and we did a air quality study with, milk cartons, milk, Vaseline to hold the particles, and wire hangers that we hung it up. And so maybe about a month later, my friend who is actually an atmospheric chemist came to the same class. And she's like, the atmospheric chemist. I study air quality. And them kids is like, you study particles in the air? And she's like, what? Like, we did an air quality study. And so I think, when I think about what you said about telling stories that make an impact, you can see it, right? So I could say, oh, I did air quality studies with 5-year-olds, and that's storytelling, right? But when we have something that move, we show the connection of how these 5-year-olds remembered a month later particles, that when you do air quality studies, you're looking for particles. And so I
Right.
think that that's a great example of what you're
Yeah.
saying, like thinking about how we move people's emotions and neurology and have them really thinking, because you can read the facts, right, on a fact sheet,
Yes,
but it's the
exactly.
stories that move people to be like, oh, that's nice. They do some great work, right?
Right, exactly. I love that.
Yeah. Okay. So, okay. Oh, we have two more questions, and I'm going to open it up for other people.
Sure.
So, how can leaders, especially those working in Black or underserved communities, shift the narrative away from the usual deficit-based framing towards something more empowering and authentic?
I I would say definitely centering our strength rather than our challenges. Like I do believe the challenges exist, right? And they're pretty obvious. I mean, yeah, they're pretty much in our face. I just read the other day that well, I actually asked you guys to maybe put this in the chat. So what percent of Black nonprofit leaders have budgets over 10 million? What do you believe? So what percent of Black nonprofit leaders have budgets over 10 million? Got 0.1%, 2%, 1 to 2%. Okay. 2. Wow. Okay. So it's actually 12%, but it's compared to 74% of white nonprofit leaders who have budgets over 10 million. So I believe like the challenges are there. Again, the facts like pretty much show what's happening. When we highlight our strengths, and I think when we highlight the fact that as a collaborative effort, like us working with other organizations, us being able to work with other businesses, it also reclaims, again, that power in that space. And we don't have to focus solely on our hardship to raise the money that we need. We actually need allyship to help us, build more momentum and fulfill our missions. And I think that's a philanthropic discussion, but it also goes into our own narratives and how we can begin to center more strengths, acknowledge the challenges, but they don't tell the whole story. And I think that's really important in the work that we do.
So then how do we make that shift from, what we're taught, right? Because a lot of how storytelling is framed is shaped from two things, white leadership and
Mm-hmm.
white-centered ways of doing things, but also from larger organizations' perspectives, right? And a lot of Black-led orgs are small and medium-sized. So um, how do we shift those narratives and shift that mindset when everything is around us saying, do it this way, right?
Yeah,
But we know that those ways
yeah.
don't
I
tell
def
the true story of our community.
Right. Again, I believe that telling our personal story alongside those stories is just important for our personal brands,
Mhm,
but also like the sector.
mhm,
I think that differentiates us between white-led leaders who are, just telling the story and
mhm,
us who are telling our story in collaboration with that story of our mission. But I think just practicing that, I think it
mhm,
takes practice, and I don't think it happens overnight because a lot of the issues that we're facing are cultural and institutional issues.
mhm,
I understand that our stories aren't going to shift that lens overnight, but we can definitely be the champions of our own representation by
mhm.
connecting our personal stories and kind of leading the way with it rather than letting them continue to carry the narrative that we're not happy with.
Mhm.
So that way, I think that can be a great way of doing that work.
Thank you. So, are there strategies that you'll recommend for nonprofit leaders who want to tell stories that truly connect, inspire, and move people to action?
Yeah, I would
And
get,
I
I
do
would,
have a follow up to that. Is that strategy different for Black leaders and non Black leaders, or is it just a universal strategy that we all can follow?
I think connecting your personal story can be a universal strategy because storytelling itself is universal. And you'll
Mhm,
find that other cultures, the way they differentiate themselves is their language. And our stories are technically our language, right? So
mhm,
I believe that, it can look different just because of the mission that we're poised with and the inequities that we're facing. But as far as best practices for storytelling, I think that there's a lot out there. And I would definitely say children's literature, of course, because I'm just going to be an advocate of that. But then also the corporate sector and the branding that a lot of corporations are doing. You can scale those strategies to your own organizations and the own sizes and resources of your organization. So I think there's a lot out there to be inspired by.
mhm,
And I think that if we just open our eyes and really continue to center our strengths, we'll find more of those stories in places that we wouldn't have expected to find.
mhm. And I do have a follow up with your said. So when we find
Mhm.
stories in other sectors that speak to us and we're like, oh, story was told great. Maybe I should adapt that or use that
Yeah.
practice. How do we make the adaptation? Because we can't just like copy and paste it. Like if we see
Oh,
a
absolutely.
great Coke commercial, we can't like use that as is. So how
Yeah.
do we translate those and scale it and adapt it to our own organizations?
Yeah, I think there's a structure that exists. Like if you think about like TED Talks,
Mhm,
there's an actual format that people have to follow when they give those presentations. And also like with children's literature, like books are either 32 pages or 48 pages. Like there's always some type of structure there. And you can follow that structure and kind of scale it to your own story. So if you see like a TED talk, or let's say like you just mentioned like a story that you're really like moved by, you can also, here's a little cheat sheet, but you can also ask Chat GPT, here's my story. Here's this story that I think is told way better than my story. Can you do a better job? Can you help me in my own voice and style to tell my story in a similar way? And Chat GPT, I still can't get that right,
mhm.
can definitely be an asset in that way and helping you to shape that story, right? And give it some structure. So does that make sense? Is that something that you would try? Um,
I need to get better at storytelling. I feel like, and I don't know if this is just as like my own personal work ethic or just what we do as Black people, but sometimes we just do the work and we don't
yeah.
think about like how we
Yes,
gonna tell the story.
exactly.
But it is really important because if we don't do the work and we don't tell our own stories, like for example, somebody was saying that my nonprofit only serves low income Black children.
Hmm.
And you posted on their social media. My friend Tokiwa does this great org and she serves low income Black children. The child she posted, mother is a nurse practitioner
Hmm.
and father is like an attorney.
Hmm.
But because I hadn't been telling my own story, people place their assumptions on if it's Black
Right.
kids, they must be low income, right? And
Exactly.
so when that happened, I was like, one, take that photo down. That child's mom is a whole nurse practitioner.
Right.
But also I'm like, we serve at the time we were serving DMV too. I'm like,
Okay.
we're in Atlanta and DMV, and there are a whole bunch of Black professionals. And so for
Mm-hmm.
you to put your biases to say is a Black child and they have to be low income when they're in these cities where it's a
Yeah.
whole bunch of Black professionals, it just was, I was just like, okay, I need to tell my story more and put more
Right.
language so people won't make assumptions about
Yeah.
who we serve. And I mean, we do serve low income kids, but we also have kids whose parents have terminal degrees. Uh,
Right.
and
Yeah. And
so,
it's right. So there's always like a part of the story that you don't get to tell.
mhm,
And then you have to kind of backtrack and tell another story that, links to it. But no, I agree that it can definitely be difficult.
mhm.
Um, you love, I'm sorry, I'm just looking at the chat.
No, so I'm going to open it up. That is all my questions.
Okay.
So I am going to open it up for anyone that has questions for you.
Sounds good.
Mhm.
I guess I'll go. Hi, I'm Shay. This has been a really good session, so thank you for organizing this. My question is about getting tips on telling stories using social media, which I see being used big time to get our stories out there. Takiwa, I will put in a plug for you. You do a great job getting your story out there on
Yes.
LinkedIn. I mean, you're all over social
Thank
media. People are on Instagram, TikTok, telling their story, sharing their lived
you.
experiences. Do you have any tips for using social media to get your story out there and your authentic self?
Yeah, absolutely. So, social media is also in my toolkit, I guess, because I started off in marketing. So, right now, I think that there's a lot of potential in social media, but I also think there's a lot of noise, right? So, there's a lot of
Okay.
distraction happening. And I
Mhm.
believe that when people talk about social media, especially like when they talk to nonprofits, they're just like, go out there, tell your story, get the facts out there. But the truth is, like, you can't be everywhere at once, right? So I believe like as institutions and leaders, we need to be a little more intentional about the spaces that we're in. Yeah, there may be a majority of institutions on TikTok and doing a great job, but maybe that isn't where your audience is. Maybe your constituents are on Instagram, or maybe your constituents on Substack, or a random social media platform that someone else isn't using. So I would say just really focusing in on where your audience is and where what you want to tell as an organization will resonate the most. Your story may not resonate great on TikTok, but it may resonate better on LinkedIn, right? So just figuring that out for your own organization and yourself is critical. And I believe a lot of organizations are kind of having to backtrack now and do that work because they just wanted to get out there. So now's the perfect time to kind of re-strategize.
Thank you.
No problem.
I do have a question. You also have to think about capacity, right? Because
Yes.
I was just like, I ain't on TikTok. That ain't even my age group. So I'm gonna let that go.
Yes, yes. And it takes a lot of time and investment in social media. I mean, the investment in social media from a nonprofit standpoint is just another conversation. I think we could be investing a little more strategically in it. But at
Mhm.
the same time, it's that capacity thing. I mean, I manage the social media and the email marketing for a museum. And that's a huge institution. And it was just me doing that work. So it can, your mission can get lost in that lack of capacity, a lack of resources. So that's important to me as well.
Okay. So Kelly has a question. Go
Sure.
ahead, Kelly.
Hey,
Kelly?
I guess my question is also just to get your is also my experience, which is it pays to get a professional to help you sometimes with your marketing. Um, and I guess I would like to hear what you have to say, but I know that in my experience, there were times that because my marketing was very professional, people assumed that I was just at a higher level or, in my organization, and they treated me differently because my marketing materials were similar to any other nonprofit at a certain level. And I think that sometimes because we're trying to do so much ourselves and we don't invest in professionals to get, you know, I've used YouTube videos that are very high quality, all of my print marketing brochures and everything, very high quality. And I feel like that really helps us. And sometimes because we're running with so little money, we don't invest in our marketing, but it was almost the marketing that enabled me to get the more money. That's all
Right.
I just wanted to. mention.
Yes, I think the marketing again is a huge part of the story. And I will say I do see a lot of nonprofits, especially those that I've worked with, like we're working with agencies and stuff. It's just the strategy isn't there. So we're coming in on the work, trying to create content, trying to create stories around stories that lack an identity. You know what I mean? Like some nonprofits have multiple identities, or like museums that have all of these different identities, and you want me to tell one story. So I think that when you're working with someone else and you are contracting that work out, like having your story down pat in a way that's like, this is how I want to authentically tell this story. And it's your job to create content around that, rather than, create this content and then I'm trying to connect myself with the content you created and it's coming off disingenuous, and disorganized. So does that make sense, Kelly?
I guess I think what I really was just trying to tell people is like getting a professional to do it instead of trying to do it
Oh,
yourself.
yes.
You know what I mean? I just feel like that's
Yes.
important because I don't have that training and it's somebody else's gifting, and I can communicate to that person what I want with this messaging and story and how, I want it to
Right.
be. But yeah, I just find that sometimes I think we do too much ourselves and we don't seek out the professionals, even when like we don't have a lot of money. Like even when my
Right.
budget was very small, I invested early in marketing and getting professionals, and I think that's important.
No, I think that's really important. I think that we're always like too close to the work in a way. So it's just like it helps to get that professional who is viewing things from a different perspective and different lens. So I agree.
Yeah, and I think people forget that there are resources for nonprofits. A lot of the leadership programs will help you develop strategy. There's tap
Yes.
group. And so, there's different layers of what you can do with where you are,
Mhm.
right? And so until you can afford to pay somebody, um, do that, right? And so like
Yes.
I used to use a lot of younger people because they good at social media.
Yes. Yeah, so
Sometimes I
good.
make my 9-year-old, 10-year-old niece do stuff. They're digital natives, right? And so I
Yes.
think it's the biggest thing. And we're gonna get to your questions. Just knowing that if it's not your expertise and you're not good at it, don't try to be good at it. Get some
Right.
help, right? Somebody you pay, somebody in your network, somebody to volunteer. But don't try to
Mhm.
learn something that you're not, it's wasted energy, especially the smaller the
Yes.
org, you don't have the
Yeah.
capacity to do that. So Joanna,
Yes, thank you. Thank you both for this some space. It's been really informative and helpful. And I just to piggyback off the last comment, I think the value of marketing, that was really nice to say, because I'm a marketer in a nonprofit, and a lot of times they're trying to cut budget from us, or but that's really an important piece. So thank you, just plus oneing that. More of a comment. I live in Harlem actually, so I met Tony and I love his gardens, and I read Harlem Grown to my 3-year-old, and it's a
Oh,
long book, actually, but
yeah.
there's this moment when the mom and the daughter are making a salad in the book, and there's like vegetables in the pot that they're making or in the bowl, and she's tossing them up, and my daughter always like tries to point out the different veggies and name them and
Oh,
stuff. I just think that was refreshing. I appreciate you drawing the connection of his authentic storytelling, because I've read that book so many times, but I just never seen it presented in this way, because like I said, as a marketer for a nonprofit, I'm always trying to figure out, how do I make sure I work in economic and workforce development, but how do I ensure that people that we serve, we're telling their stories with care? It's a lot of Black, brown youth, people of color, and I'm just like, I don't want to fall into that bucket of sounding like, a
yeah.
non-African American or not Black person that's, saying it inauthentically. So I think
Right.
that really, that connection made me think in a way. And I'm like, I'm gonna go read it back with a new lens of like how it ties to my everyday work, right? Like a children, other
Yes.
books in that space. So I just wanted to say thank you for sharing that as a blueprint. It was a
Thank you, Joanna. I'm glad it landed, because at first I'm like, should I share that? I don't want people to know that like I read a whole bunch of children's book on my spare time. But it's a great, if you will, framework. I don't like that word, but it's a great model. So thank you for sharing that.
all right, Jahari, and then Keisha.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much for putting this together. This is great, Tokiwa. and has been super helpful. We used a company of probably about a year or two ago that helped us think through our messaging framework.
Mhm.
And one of the things that they use with us is kind of the hero framework of storytelling. And it helped us really not just talk about the problem and the plan that we provided and the solution and the call to action. But for us, it really started to center our story. And I appreciated that because it allowed for our funders and our clients to kind of think about our work differently in a way that I don't know if I would have brought out personally, right?
Right.
But now, to your point, Sierra, I really want to highlight the journey of our students, like the
Mm.
transformation that's happening in workforce development and in what we're doing. And sometimes I struggle because I don't want to highlight their experience and feel like I'm tokenizing it either. You know what I mean? So I want to be very careful with at what point is it okay to share too much without it feeling exploitive or um, devaluing them, but at the same time, acknowledging that there is a transformation that's happening and we are a part of that story of the transformation. And I'm honored to be in that place, but the transformation can't happen without a story arc of like, this is what it was, this is how you helped, and this is the outcome. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know how to do it without
Yeah.
telling it. So I would love your thoughts on how do we celebrate the client experience and celebrate their own personal journey without feeling like I'm tokenizing them or exploiting it.
Yeah, so just a few things. So I'm not anti-framework. I just don't like to promote a certain framework, right? So I do agree. I love that you mentioned the hero framework because that works for you, worked for your organization and your storytelling. But they're just like, I feel as if people and organizations should adjust their story, like whichever framework they choose to their actual missions and stories. So I love that there's hero. I think there's story arc and story brand. I believe Tokiwa, we had a little story brand conversation. Yes, but yeah, I think that one of the things that I do see a lot of organizations struggle with is telling that story without the consent of those stakeholders and constituents. And it doesn't feel like you're doing like something harmful, right? Because you just want to get the story out. But in a way you can, it's about the narrative and that cultural context, right? You miss out on things when you tell the story of someone else. So I believe that, again, there's a way to incorporate maybe those students into your storytelling in some kind of way. Whether it be, like, again, social media is a great way to start with that, even if it means you have to go the extra mile to get consent of those students from those families. I think you'll come out with much better stories, and it'll be worth the extra effort.
Yeah, no, we definitely did consent. So we
Okay, yes,
not
great.
tell a story without the consent.
Yeah.
But I guess it was more, I think sometimes people can also carry a shame in maybe some of what
They're going through.
And they may not always want to share,
Mm.
but the story, and for us, sometimes the way in which philanthropic dollars comes in the transformation and the theory of change that's actually happening
Right.
the work. And so I can't dismiss the barriers that exist and how we're
Absolutely.
alleviating the barriers, but I also don't want to exploit the barriers where people start to feel like that is who they are when that's not the truth. You understand what I'm
Absolutely.
saying? Like there's a balance, and I don't know if I know the right balance. Because
Yeah,
you have to ask to get it out of them. You know what I mean?
exactly. And that was what I was going to mention is, what is the story that they do want to tell? Like the students alone. There was an experiment with Lego, and they were promoting like girls and creativity, and they did kind of like this focus group where they put girls with their moms or their parents, and they told them, create something that's I believe, like the perfect, sculpture or something. And the girls struggled for a really long time. Like it took them a long time to conceptualize what perfect may have meant. But when they changed the language, they got a totally different result. Create something that's pretty, create something you would love to live in, or that your pet. So I think that like learning how to talk with stakeholders like students may be worth diving into. That's just unique to your organization though. But again, storytelling is unique. It has to be authentic in some type of way. But maybe what I'm trying to say is finding ways to let them lead the story so that, you know, those stories are told, they're as close to their stories as possible. And again, it's that system, right? That makes, like you mentioned earlier, like the grants are asking questions that probe you to tell the story in a certain way. But I think that the more you practice and the closer you get to the constituents, you find that there are other ways we can kind of tell this story and still get what we need.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Isha.
Hey y'all, how's it going? It's so nice to see so many beautiful faces on here.
The
Tokiwa, thank you for putting this together. I really appreciate this dialogue and this interview process. Sierra, thanks for sharing your expertise with us as well. I want to double down on what Joanna was saying, and I think kind of frame it in a way that might speak to Jahari, what you were asking as well. I wanted to start by saying, Sierra, I love that you use children's books and children's literacy as a form of empowerment to Black leaders. I think it's important actually to frame that innocence and that beauty in that way, because sometimes we get lost, in fact, in the dollars and cents. So we get lost in the, framing that we forget the purpose of why we're doing it, no matter if we're serving directly young people or not. I think starting from there is humbling, and there's an innocence there that I love to tap into. The book that I'd like to highlight that I think does this well, and I think this speaks, Jahari, to what you were saying. I'll kind of loop back around there. It's a book called The Big Box by Toni Morrison and her son Slade Morrison. It's one of my favorites. I started using it with young people, but I now only use it with adults, and it serves. Let me tell you. But the reason why I really enjoy this book, and I think why I would recommend this book, is because it gives insight into systemic issues and pattern behavior that is systemic. Now, why I think that's important is because part of why, Jahari, what you're saying is right on point. Part of why we struggle with how to tell this story is because of the perpetuation of oppression, using our stories, abusing our stories, misusing our stories, taking out the saddest, worst, tragic parts of our story, and monetizing it, in fact, not for our benefit. But I think part of what Toni Morrison and her son Slade Morrison did very well with this children's book, that speaks to systemic issues, is they told a story that connected to our shared humanity, but they didn't necessarily start with the tragedy. They started with even the sense of good intentions that still lead to the terrible impacts. They started with individual people, but showed how it connected a community of people to these experiences. They talked about the importance of collectivism in community and housing, but they also talked about how individual people are experiencing things a little bit differently and uniquely in those spaces. And I think it's a both and. I think storytelling is a both and always. And so if we struggle with if or how to tell that story, sometimes it's because we're doing our own storytelling in our heads. We're projecting already, right? Or we're fearful of what the projection is. But I think when we don't start that story with secondly, but we say firstly, here's where we started before. Here's what our community is known for. Here's the beauty. But here's the beauty that's been ripped away. and here are some of the here's what it looks like now because of it. And so I'm meeting these young people where they are, and this isn't where they started, this isn't where they should be, but I'm meeting them where they are. The reason they're here is because of these systemic issues. And so when you're funding us, you're countering these systemic issues that they're facing versus this is who they are. This is their circumstance for these systemic reasons. And so I think that's a really good option and way to think about how to retell the stories and give them back their power. This is not who you are. This is your circumstance for these reasons that were that was a part of the intentional design. And I think again, to end, Toni Morrison and Slade Morrison's book, The Big Box, really does a good job with that. Thanks again.
Well, thank you, Keisha, for saying that. First of all, I'm a little too excited over here, but most people don't know that Toni Morrison wrote books for her son. So I love that, The Big Box. That's awesome. But I also really liked what you said about using transformation as a, you know, like a pinpoint for those, for structuring those stories. Because transformation stories, I think, tell the best part of anyone's story. Here's where I was, here's where I am now, here's where I want to be. That is a really great way of looking at things. So I appreciate you for saying that. Thank you for coming in and asking all these great questions. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So do anybody else have any questions? If not, Sierra, I wanted you to just have your closing thoughts on how we can lead, because I feel like you gave us so many gems. I'm glad this is recorded so we can listen to it later. Because I'm not that great at note taking. And it was so much, like so much. So thank you for leading it. So do you have any closing? I don't even want to frame what it should be, like whatever you feel like we should think about, like the wuha, the big thing, you know, that we need to, where we start to shift. What are the things we need to think about, like top of mind as we go on this journey to become better storytellers?
I will say that, you know, I guess I'll end with a CTA, which is like kind of a call to action. And it will be to think of the story that you're not telling, and maybe the story that you haven't gotten to tell yet. And again, bringing into, I believe, what Keisha said about that transformation, thinking about that through that lens of the story that you haven't told yet. I think that's a great way to start with practicing telling those stories, and just showing up in spaces like this, you know, I mean, was even helpful to me because I now I know that like relating children's book to leadership really does land. And I know that like you guys are experiencing some really transformative work where storytelling is needed, right? You guys just have such great stories to tell. So it's really nice to be in a space like this, but just to see and hear all of what you guys are doing. And I advise everyone to just keep showing up in spaces like this. And I'm always a champion of all of your work. So thank you, Tokiwa, again.
And what is the best way to contact you? You can put it in the chat, you know, do we find, or I can email it to everybody, whatever you prefer.
So I'm Cierra Shelby on LinkedIn. That's kind of where I hang out most.
Okay.
But I also have an Instagram that champions minority female literacy. And if anyone kind of wants to follow my journey with that, I'll put my Instagram name.
Okay. Because you get some great tips on LinkedIn that I'm like, okay, I can't only repost her. I gotta repost. But
that's so funny. I feel like that too. I'm always reposting the same people, but I'm like, listen, I'm always gonna be a champion, you know, of great storytelling and great social media.
Thank you. Well, thank you again, Sierra, for giving us some of your time, sharing strategies. Thank you for everyone for having this conversation. It was a really enriching conversation. Sometimes people do not have insights or input, or they just let us have the conversation. But this was so rich where I felt like it was such a great thing where we shared and learned from each other. So thank you so much for taking time in your day to learn this, to have this conversation. I hope that it was helpful, and that we leave learning how to tell better stories about ourselves as leaders and about our communities. And thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Okay. Bye.